The Positive Pause is a motivational-minded podcast covering topics women want to know about as they journey to and through menopause, focusing on subjects that impact women's health and healthy aging, including what it means to age healthfully. The Positive Pause features experts and influencers from a variety of industries and specialties. The information and opinions expressed on the Positive Pause are not intended to replace the services of trained professionals or to provide specific medical advice. To see the National Menopause Foundation's full medical disclaimer, please visit nationalmenopausefoundation.org.
Welcome to the Positive Pause. I'm Claire Gill, founder of the National Menopause Foundation. Joining me for this episode is Jennifer Garrison, PhD, Assistant Professor at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, Faculty Director of the Global Consortium for Reproductive Longevity and Equality, and co-director of the Buck USC Biology of Aging PhD program. She also holds secondary appointments in the Department of Cellular and Molecular Pharmacology at the University of California, San Francisco, and the Davis School of Gerontology at the University of Southern California. Dr. Garrison's research focuses on understanding how chemical communication between the brain and other tissues influence aging. The Garrison Lab at the Buck Institute studies interactions between the ovary and brain during middle age to identify the neuronal factors that lead to the onset of reproductive decline. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Garrison.
Thank you, Claire. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, I'm excited to finally get a chance to talk to you on this podcast. I was fortunate enough to be introduced to you at another menopause event earlier this year, and I'm delighted to talk a little bit more about the work you're doing and its potential impact on women's health. So let's start by talking a little bit about the Buck Institute and what brought you there and the type of research that you do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I wear a lot of different hats, as you mentioned in your introduction. And so I am an academic research scientist. So I run a laboratory at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, which is an independent academic research institute that's located just north of San Francisco in California. And the Buck Institute is a freestanding academic center, kind of like the Broad Institute or the Salk, if you're familiar with them. And everyone here, unlike those places, everyone here is really focused around trying to understand basic mechanisms of aging, which to some people sounds a little bit odd. But actually, if you think about it, aging is like a public health pandemic. So age is the number one risk factor for many of the diseases of the modern world, things like heart disease and stroke and neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer. The major risk factor, far more than your cholesterol or, your genetic background, your age is actually the most important thing for determining whether or not you're going to get one of these diseases. And what happens as you age, as we're all familiar with, oftentimes you'll end up with not one, but many of these age-related diseases. So the goal of our research is really to understand what the underlying causes of aging are and tackle that as a way to tackle multiple diseases simultaneously. So that's what we're doing. And our goal is not, thanks. Our goal is not to increase lifespan, so we're not trying to make it so that people can live to be 900. That's not the goal. The goal really is to increase what we call health span. So that would be the number of years that someone's healthy. So what we'd like to do is increase that period of time when you're healthy and compress that period of time at the end of life when you're plagued by all these age-related diseases. So I started my lab here as a neuroscientist. So I trained as a neuroscientist, and I started my lab at the Buck Institute because I really do think that the brain is the key player for systemic aging. I think, I'm totally biased, so it's important that your audience understands that. But the brain is really, it's involved in this back and forth conversation with the rest of your body. And it's essentially controlling everything that's happening, but it's not like a dictator. It's actually listening to and integrating feedback from all of your organ systems and changing things accordingly. So there's this dynamic two-way conversation between the brain and all the other organs in your body. And it's mediated by these chemicals that can signal over long distances. And that's really what my lab studies, is how the changes in that conversation with age might lead to what we consider systemic aging. Was that too much, Claire? Sorry.
No, that's really, really fascinating. And I think what's really important too is, when I started the National Menopause Foundation, so many people said to me, oh yeah, you need to rebrand menopause, and you need to fix anti-aging. And it's obviously those are things that we do deal with in society. But what's so fascinating about your research is really looking at, what are these developmental things that happen as we age? And as you said, how can that be used positively to either prevent disease or to do other things? And in so many ways, it's really looking very positively at how we age and how, as you said, to have the most healthy lifespan versus how long do you live? It doesn't matter that as much as, are you living healthy? Are you able to do all the things you'd like to do in the years that you have? And I think that's what's really fascinating. Not to mention, I think we have started as a society to realize the importance of studying the brain and the connectivity between the brain and so many of these other things, and then how that impacts us emotionally and psychologically and physically. So it's really fascinating that you're doing this. And that's how I felt when I first met you, was like, I am so glad someone's studying this. This is incredible. So let's talk a little bit about a specific event that you coordinated that I was able to attend, that was bringing together, scientists studying not just reproductivity and not just aging, but kind of connecting the two and bringing them together to sort of share research and talk through how the impact of ovarian development impacts how we age, and then obviously how that impacts equality when it comes to women's health. So I know there was a lot covered during that conference, but can you just talk a little bit about why that type of collaboration is so important and why you wanted to be involved in coordinating that meeting?
Oh yeah, so coordinating that meeting was part of some of the other hats that I wear. So this was a conference that was the first ever international conference a scientific conference focused on reproductive aging. And the work that I do kind of led me in this direction a few years ago, around the same time that we had a really amazing donation from the Biacco Foundation to start a center at the Buck Institute to study this issue. And what I'm talking about really at the Buck, in the center, we call it the Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality. In the center, what we're doing is really the first facility in the world that's focused solely on reproductive longevity as it relates to aging. So what I mean by that is, as we're making progress in extending healthy longevity, and I think there's a lot of work that's gone into this, not just at the Buck Institute, but at research centers all over the world. We know now that biological aging is malleable. We can actually hopefully change someone's health span. But as we're making progress in that space, if we don't address reproductive longevity, then we're actually making gender inequality worse, not better. And that's because, beyond reproduction and fertility, menopause makes a woman's body age faster. Right? Menopause, as you well know, it sets off a cascade of negative health effects in a woman's body. And even in healthy women, it has a really dramatic effect on quality of life and disease risk. So we think about it really as an issue of equality. And if you think about how the male reproductive system ages, there's always this graph of function over time for every organ system. And we're all pretty familiar with how that declines with age, right? And it's kind of a square curve. And the male reproductive system does actually go through a decline with age. It's called andropause. But that decline is really coordinated with the rest of the body. It happens synchronously. Whereas reproductive aging in females is really asynchronous with the rest of the body. It happens decades before, it happens really when a woman is in her late 20s, early 30s is when her ovaries begin to show overt signs of aging, which I think a lot of women don't realize. most women figure this out when they go to use their ovaries and they can't. Right. It's an unwelcome surprise for a lot of women, but that it's really a system that's aging prematurely compared to the rest of the body. And what we'd like to do is just figure out what's causing, what is the causal factor or factors that are really signaling to drive ovarian aging so early in life. And we'd like to just sync it up with the rest of the body. In short, my goal, if I was to put it into a moonshot sort of way, our goal is to, get rid of menopause. But along the way, if we can, figure out what's causing it and maybe slow it down, or at least get rid of some of the negative health consequences that are associated with it, then I would really consider that a win.
That would be huge. And I think that is so interesting. There was something when we originally met that we were talking through, and that was one that human females and a couple of species of whales are really the only ones that go through menopause.
Yeah. The biology is fascinating. And I think a lot of women and also men don't really know that much about the female reproductive system. But it's true. Humans and a few species of whale were the only ones who go through true menopause in the animal kingdom. So it's not a biological imperative. It doesn't have to happen because most animals don't do it. And we don't know why that is. And that's a fascinating research question on its own. And we actually have a scientist at the center who's working on that. Her name is Dina Amira. But I will say, so, we started the center in 2018, and my research had led me in this direction just because I was working on these signaling molecules that coordinate, the brain and the rest of the body. And we were trying to figure out how one of them worked during aging, and it led us to the reproductive system. And, when you start to think about the parts of the brain that control reproduction, the neurons that are in those circuits, they control every single aspect of reproduction, right? Puberty, menstruation, fertility, conception, pregnancy, childbirth, lactation, even childcare. The parts of the brain that really control all of that also house the centers for homeostasis. So things like energy balance and fluid balance and temperature regulation and circadian rhythms. Those are all in the same part of the brain. So when you start to think about the symptoms, not just of menopause, but, of everything related to female physiology, right? Mood, emotions, bloating, things that happen during your cycle.
Yeah.
All of that stuff, they're all in the same place. And so suddenly, like when you look at female physiology through the lens of the brain, things start to make a lot more sense. Anyway, I was really ecstatic to be part of this new center. But as we were building it, it became so obvious to me that we needed to do something bigger. There's a lot about this particular field that's disorganized. There's some practicalities that need to be addressed. The biggest issue is that there's really a lack of funding in the space, which was a surprise to me because the biology and the questions that are there to be answered are so fascinating. Like the fact that we don't know what makes a good egg. We don't know where along a woman's reproductive trajectory this causal thing happens that starts to signal decline in ovaries. The fact that, we don't really understand even what the full complement of hormones that the ovary makes to signal. We don't know. There's so many things we don't know. It's crazy that we don't have more people and scientists working on these problems. So when we start, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, and more interest in the funding, as you said. I mean, these are essential questions about the really life force. If we're talking about women's health and reproductive aging and the ovary, then it really is about, the life force and how we continue to procreate and make the continuation of the species. So you think it would be more of interest, not to mention the practicality, as you said, of preventing diseases that happen with the deterioration of the ovary and all of those kinds of things. So we do need to get more people involved and more people demanding that this be a top research item across the board because it has such an impact on our health.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, women's health research in general is underfunded, but this particular area of women's health, reproductive aging is just so woefully underfunded. And I think a lot of the research dollars, historically at least, have gone to assisted reproductive technologies, which are an excellent Band-Aid. But wouldn't it be, how much better would it be if we could just figure out why ovaries decline and, keep that from happening so early? Then we wouldn't need IVF and IVM. But, when we started the center, we realized there was a bigger need and that we weren't really going to make much of an impact on our own. And so that was where the Global Consortium was born. So there's a second initiative that grew out of a donation from the Biacco Foundation, which is the Global Consortium for Reproductive Longevity and Equality. And that is what I direct. And our goal really and truly is to facilitate and accelerate translating these basic science discoveries into products and therapies that will help women. And we do that primarily right now by funding research. So we are literally a grant-making entity. And so we gave away our first grants in 2020 to 23 scientists all over the world. And we are going to continue to give away grants every single year as long as I can raise money to do that. But, the reason I met you and the reason that I found the National Menopause Foundation is because I'm also trying to build the network of really literally anyone who has an interest in this space. So you asked about collaboration, and I think this is an area of science and medicine where scientists and clinicians, doctors need to talk to each other. This is a place where the communication and forcing these conversations between groups that normally don't talk to each other, but, forcing that kind of brainstorming, and also hopefully the consortium can be a bridge between them to facilitate, the connecting the people who have the patient populations with the scientists who have the questions. That's one of the things I've spent a lot of time on recently. And that's how I met you.
Well, yeah, happy about that. And certainly want to make sure that we're involved in, again, promoting this work and figuring out how do we keep that dialogue going? How do we advocate more for the research and the women's health? I want to go back to something you had said too that was, just a minute ago about there's so little that we know about, the different stages and how the ovary impacts and all of that good stuff. And, I was thinking about the articles and the studies I've seen about the fact that, even now in 2022, it is impossible to replicate breast milk. And that, the formulas and the things we've done, but they actually haven't figured out exactly how to replicate breast milk. And you would think, again, by now that would be something that would be studied and understood. And I know they're trying and making progress, but that's one of the things why this is so important as we think about these things, because there's so much that we don't know. And I also know too, and you probably are much more familiar with this, but that, during reproductive cycles and during menopause, there's so much that happens related to other diseases and the impact on the body. And so, for example, women with MS, with multiple sclerosis, they relapse at the start of their cycle. They relapse when their hormones change. And so obviously the people are trying to study that. But another thing that they're studying is that women with MS, no matter how severe the MS, go into remission during pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And that's fascinating. But again, there's so much research needs to be done that, why is that? Why does this impact women so dramatically during their cycle? And then again, that they could stay in remission for the 9 months that they're in, that they're pregnant, and then again, go back into relapsing when they're done with their pregnancy. So yeah, it's much interesting stuff connected to this topic.
Yeah, there's so much to learn and discover here. When I really started to dig into it, I was both horrified that we don't know this information, but also, as a scientist, I was pretty intrigued, and I think it's really exciting. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with these grants, is to pull in scientists from other fields who might have wanted to work in this space, but couldn't because there wasn't funding before. We're also, and I hope we're partnering with you on this, trying to advocate for more funding from governmental bodies in this space. The NIH has not really been a great funder of reproductive aging research. But, all of this comes down to the fact that the male body has been biology's baseline for a long time. And the female counterpart has, for the most part, been considered noisy and has been understudied and in some cases purposefully excluded from biomedical studies because, the ovulatory cycles were considered confounding variables, right? That adds noise and mess to the system. So better we not look at that.
Yeah, right.
Which is really sad.
That is really bad. But we're only becoming more aware of that now. I think, certainly for me in my knowledge of women's health in the last decade or so, understanding even, as you said, like how clinical trials came about and how so many things were just, things that were studied in men that they then just applied to women as best they could because studying women was a little too complicated given the variability of our cycles and on all of the things that happen. And again, it's only really within the last few decades that the communities have been like, that's not good enough. We're really going to have to do the research on women in this. And then, of course, now it's the focus on, are we getting diverse populations within that? Are we just studying white women and white men and, how to get that variable? So as you said, there's so much work to be done. But I would say I was really hopeful. And when I met the scientists that were at your conference and the work that they're doing and their passion for answering these questions that we need to answer. And I love the fact that it was bringing together these scientists and clinicians from a global perspective, because there are obviously areas where some of the it's a little bit more advanced in this area and other countries where it's advanced in this area, and then how do we share that knowledge to actually bring things together really quickly? So
we have to bring all the creative minds into the same room, and that includes more than just scientists and physicians.
That's right.
But the scientific questions, the medical questions they're fundamental, but they're also fascinating. You mentioned the link between where a woman is in her cycle and her susceptibility to things like MS. There's also, if there's underlying dysfunction in the reproductive organs in females, even in young, healthy women, that can really profoundly affect other parts of the body, right? So, for example, we know that women with PCOS are prone to metabolic diseases later in life. And we have absolutely no idea why that is. We don't know what causes PCOS. We don't even know, we all are familiar with this graph of egg quality and quantity, right? And it's usually characterized as a graph with a slight decline and then a single inflection point and a cliff, right? And that cliff is where menopause happens. And what the graph is depicting is not just egg number, but also egg quality over time. We know that both the number and the quality declines, but we don't know why that is. We don't know where the decline happens. We don't know what causes it. We also don't know why, a woman's reproductive span, so the age at which she goes through menopause, it's so highly variable between individuals.
Right. Yeah.
The average age at menopause spans like 14 years, and that's all considered normal. And there's nothing else in human health that's like that, that's so incredibly variable. But it kind of speaks to this idea that graph we are so familiar with, well, that's absolutely true on average. It is not true at the level of the individual. It was one of the most multivariable signatures in all of human health. And I think we really need to treat it that way. I would say, speaking to your audience, I think it's so important that women understand that those average graphs are often really inaccurate when it comes to an individual. There's plenty of young women who go through periods of infertility for reasons we don't understand. And there's plenty of older women who go through periods of hyperfertility. And it's stochastic and it's dynamic and it's complex. And that doesn't mean that we can't figure it out. It just means that we need to devote a little bit more attention to understanding it.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's such a great point, right? It doesn't mean we can't solve this. It just means we have to have more focus on it. Well, one of my next questions was going to be, talking about the fact that, so many women are, not aware of what happens to us during the menopausal transition. And there's so much education needed, which we hope to help bridge the gap for, to, really improve medical care for women as we transition through the menopausal stage. But is there something specific from all the research you've seen that you think every woman should know about reproductive aging? Is it that graph that you were talking about, that it's so individual, but,
I would love for women to understand that, yes, and we are trying to reframe that narrative, the narrative that, it's this like fertility and function in your ovaries isn't like a bank, that only goes in one direction. It really is stochastic and cyclical, and it's much more complex than we really usually give it space for. And I think that if I was, to say one thing, like reproductive aging is going to impact every single female on the planet who is lucky enough to make it to midlife. And while I think most women are at least peripherally aware of the fact that decline in egg quality and quantity has these significant clinical consequences that we recognize as infertility or miscarriage or birth defects, these effects that really impact childbearing. The ovary is this amazing organ, and it produces endocrine hormones, and not just the ones that we know about. It produces a whole cocktail of chemicals that are essential for general health, that have nothing to do with fertility, nothing at all. And it's that function that we're talking about preserving right now, is just to preserve ovarian function in a way that keeps a woman's body healthy for longer. That's really what we're talking about. So often when I'm talking about this, people get confused and they conflate the two things. And while, they are related, obviously, these functions are both mediated by the same organ. Mm-hmm. But it takes a lot more than functioning ovaries to have a healthy child. You also need functioning uterus and lots of other things.
Right.
And I do think that if we can extend the age at which a woman goes through menopause and hopefully find a way to preserve egg quality with time, that will have a positive impact on fertility and a woman's ability to choose when she has a child.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about, having women give birth in their 70s. What we're talking about is preserving ovarian function so that we can preserve their overall health.
Well, that's interesting, as you said. And I think our basic understanding is that the ovary's sole purpose is reproduction. And as you just stated, there are so many other things it regulates and impacts. And that's what we don't know. And that's what we need to study. And so I know this is a very controversial topic and it's very personal, but given our current landscape with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, from a scientific community, obviously we just said that this area of study doesn't get the attention that it needs, and that there are so many unanswered questions that are related to reproduction, but aren't necessarily about birthing a child. So how are you in the scientific community looking to make a case for extending research in this area of reproduction longevity? And do you think that this current landscape we're in is a setback to that?
I do. I think obviously a woman's reproductive organs should be under her own control and no one else's. And I think that the hyper-focus, I think that the focus that we have right now around abortion and a woman's right to choose when and if to be pregnant, that obviously folds into everything we're talking about. The social aspects of reproductive aging that I talk about often really center around equality, because, if you think about it from the perspective of healthy aging, then on a societal level, every aspect of a female's life is influenced by the fact that she's going to go through this reproductive decline in midlife. Decisions about career, family planning, overall health, even for those of us like me who didn't want to have biological children. From the minute I went through puberty, every decision I made as an adult was overshadowed by this ticking biological clock. And separately from fertility, whether I realize it or not, the fact that I'm going to go through menopause at some point has really dramatic implications for my health. And men just don't have these considerations. It's a biological difference that really sets up an inherent inequality. And so from a societal point of view, that's what I think about. But now that we're in this political environment that we're in, I think that considering, philosophically, but also practically how themes of reproduction influence politics and religion and science, I think that's a conversation worth having. I think a lot about how the work we're doing here can unify us and evolve us into a new paradigm, for thinking about women's health. And part of this too is just stepping back and realizing that when we talk about women's health, it's often framed as a subcategory of medicine, the same way that kidney health is a subcategory of medicine. And yet we need to reframe things so that we're thinking about women's health from a holistic point of view and not pigeonholing it into this tiny little subcategory when we're really talking about half the population. It's not a subcategory.
That's right. It's not a subcategory. And how do we, advance that? I think a lot of that too. I love your reflection on that. Like you said, I think you're right that this conversation we're having about reproduction and whether and a woman's right to choose or any of those things, it is impacted by so many of the things that by the science, by medicine, by the social, by the religious, by scientific, et cetera. And it is worth a respectful conversation to look at, what that impact is going to be. And then is that the intention that we all want? And so it will be interesting to see as we move forward how you and I both advocate for additional, funding to support women's health and studying women's health. And particularly, you said, this topic of reproductive longevity, which really is, as you said, just such an overall health issue from cradle to grave, as we talk about the development of the ovaries and how that impacts and what happens afterwards, and the brain connectivity is something more than one specific area of a woman's biology. And so I think it'll be really interesting to continue those conversations. So we're out of time. I could talk forever, but I do want to be respectful of your time. And is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience that we haven't yet covered?
I would just say that, I think this is a historic moment. I think this is a historic opportunity that we have to pioneer this marrying two scientific fields together, aging research and reproductive biology. And we're trying very hard to think about ways to inject capital and creativity so that science and the entrepreneurial spirit can come together in the same room. And ideally, we're trying to change old narratives. And so we talked a lot about different narratives, but we really want to enlighten a field that's kind of been encumbered or hung up on old narratives for a long time. And we're looking for increased public engagement. We want you and the audience to help us support the science and the scientists. They really are the heroes of this field. And that could mean, as much as you're able to, that could mean just talking about what we're doing. We need ambassadors. We need people to talk about what's happening and to really, to get out there and tell people that this is an important issue and that we want to shine a light on it.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Garrison, for being here and sharing this important information with us. And I hope all the listeners are as excited, as inspired by what you're doing and all the work of the scientists that work with you as I was when we first met. And that's why I really wanted to be able to share this with our listening audience. So we will definitely post information about the Buck Institute and the Global Consortium for Reproductive Longevity and Equality with the notes for this episode. So I really do encourage all of you to visit those links and learn more. And if you have an interest in supporting either financially or as advocates, please consider that. It is really important. And I love what you said, Dr. Garrison, about this being a historic moment. And I think that's true across the board. I mean, the fact that there was no National Menopause Foundation before 2019 is pretty surprising too, but here we are, and there's so much good that we can do together. So I look forward.
It's amazing. I have to say, to your audience, what you're doing is amazing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, well, we're going to be more amazing because we're going to get more people excited and engaged in this conversation. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. And if you do, please subscribe to the Positive Pause podcast so you never miss an episode. And please share the information about this podcast with your family and friends. Keep that dialogue and conversation going. Thank you again to my guest, Dr. Jennifer Garrison, and thank you for listening. We hope you'll tune in to another episode of The Positive Pause.